Is it possible to spend your whole life loving, sacrificing, only to become the very thing your child is ashamed of? He stood quietly behind the lavish floral arch of the ceremony. His blazer was faded, his shoes worn thin. Is he the janitor? A sneer broke the silence. A black stepfather. How embarrassing. They mocked him, and they mocked his daughter for daring to bring him. Jeremiah said nothing, he simply stood there. No one knew. In just a few minutes, the very name they scorned would bring the entire room to silence. And when he walked on the stage, would his daughter bow her head? Or finally stand tall and call him Dad? Stay with us. What happened next silenced every voice in that room. Riverside University. Late afternoon. Golden light slanted like honey across the polished wooden floors of the graduation hall. Everything shimmered with celebration. Dignified, joyful, alive with laughter and a frenzy of camera flashes. Hundreds of deep purple robes shimmered as they moved between rows of white chairs. Everyone was busy posing, smiling, capturing their moment of glory. Everyone, except one man. He stood still, apart, quiet as a shadow beneath the white floral backdrop at the far end of the hall. Jeremiah Warren. A faded blazer, a tie fastened off-center, brown leather shoes worn thin at the heels. No one greeted him, no one noticed him. There was no honorary parent badge pinned to his chest like all the others. Just him and the invitation card he held in his hand, the words printed clearly, Elise Warren, family admission, one person. Elise stood at the center of the room, graduation gown perfectly pressed, hair neatly tied, diploma in hand. She had just walked past a group of professors when she paused, turned. Her eyes scanned the crowd until finally they landed on him. Jeremiah didn't wave, didn't call her name. He just stood there, quiet, still, a gaze full of warmth, full of pride. She began walking toward him, and the eyes began to follow. A woman from the Whitmore group clicked her tongue. She's walking toward him. You mean that man in the worn-out coat? He looks more like a janitor. No one knew who he was. No one asked. They saw the old blazer, the scuffed shoes, and assumed he didn't belong. But Elise, she knew exactly who he was. He was the one who had always been there, just behind the frame of every graduation photo she'd ever taken. This time was no different. Except this time, the spotlight wouldn't be able to dim him anymore. To the left of the auditorium sat the Whitmore family section. Ivory silk dresses, tailored suits. Wine swirled elegantly in slender crystal glasses. They clustered into a tight circle, as if forming their own atmosphere, a private orbit where people like Jeremiah were never meant to enter. A silver-haired man leaned slightly, whispering to the woman beside him, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah. Must be the chauffeur. The woman smirked, gently swirling her champagne. I heard he's just the stepfather, no blood relation. They spoke as if Elise couldn't hear, but she was standing right there, just a few steps away, still holding her diploma. Her polite smile frozen halfway. Jeremiah stood quietly behind her, not turning around, not furrowing a brow, not reacting at all. But Elise saw it. She always saw it. She saw his shoulders stiffen just slightly, his jaw clench, the invitation card in his hand pressed gently into his other palm, as if grounding himself. Elise turned away, hiding the flush rising in her face, not from pride, but from shame. Not shame for him, shame for herself, for the fact that once she too had thought the same way they did. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward him, reaching for some part of him, as if to remind herself that he was real, that he was still here, that he hadn't left. And just like every time before in her life, he didn't pull away. Elise gripped Jeremiah's hand tightly. His warmth hadn't changed, still as steady, as present, as all the years he had quietly stood behind every chapter of her life. And then, the memories rushed in. She was 14. A soft drizzle fell that afternoon as she waited in front of her high school gates, standing beside 3 of her classmates, straight hair, branded jackets, voices sharp like they were always competing to outwit one another. An old pickup truck rolled up. Its paint was peeling, the passenger side window patched with duct tape. The passenger door let out a familiar rattle as it opened. Jeremiah stepped out, his hands still smudged with engine grease, wearing a faded mechanic's shirt. One of the girls let out a laugh. "Who's that? Your delivery guy?" Elise swallowed hard, cheeks burning. She rushed toward the truck, stammering, "No, he's just someone my mom hired to help with the car." Jeremiah said nothing. He simply gave the girls a small nod, then got back in. On the passenger seat sat a cup of hot chocolate, something he always brought her after school. Just a quiet habit of his, ever since she started growing up. She didn't say a word the whole ride home. Stared out the window, silently hoping the rain would fall harder to drown out the silence inside the car. Jeremiah drove like he always did, calm, patient. When they reached home, he said only one thing. "It might be colder tomorrow. Make sure you wear something warm." He didn't scold her, didn't ask why. But from that day on, he started parking a little farther from the school gates, and she never called him Dad in front of anyone again. Until today. Elise blinked back to the present, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. His hand was still there, resting in hers. As if that rainy afternoon had never happened, Elise pulled her thoughts away from the past and returned to the present. Beside her, the empty seat in the family section remained untouched. And it would stay that way. Her mother hadn't come. A text had arrived early that morning, just one short line. "I'm sorry, something urgent came up in Connecticut. Sending love. Take pictures for me, okay?" It was the 7th time in 5 years her mother had missed a major milestone in Elise's life, and the 7th time Jeremiah had shown up in her place. Not by plane ticket, but in his old pickup truck, driving across 3 states through the night, just to arrive at the ceremony as the sun began to rise. No complaints, no reminders of sacrifice. Elise remembered clearly how he had called the night before. "Are you sure your mother won't be there?" "I'm sure." "Then I'll try to get there a little earlier, so you don't feel alone." "Uncle." That was still what she called him, even though for all these years he was the only one who never missed a single event in her life. From her 6th grade science fair to her very first college interview, and today was no exception. Jeremiah stood quietly in a corner, where no one stopped to chat, where no one asked him for a family photo, and where no one knew. He had driven 12 hours, slept curled in the back seat, just to stand here now and watch her graduate. Elise swallowed the emotion rising in her throat. She didn't cry, but what choked her up was that familiar silence. The post-ceremony reception began. Long tables draped in white linen were neatly arranged. Tart trays, spirals of fresh fruit, and rows of amber-tinted wine glasses stood in perfect symmetry. Elise was standing beside an old friend when she heard a soft burst of laughter behind her. "Let's hope he sticks around to clean up after the event." Another voice followed with a giggle. "Totally looks like the guy who collects dishes at the end." It was Vanessa Whitmore, the cousin who always wore heavier makeup than necessary, always chose dresses tighter than appropriate, and always knew how to let her words float like air, while cutting deep like glass. Elise didn't need to turn around. She knew exactly who it was. And she knew exactly where those eyes were darting. Toward Jeremiah, who was quietly helping himself to a glass of water instead of wine, standing near the floral arrangement so as not to block anyone's way. Jeremiah didn't react. He offered a small smile to a young boy passing by, nodded gently to a catering staff member, as if he hadn't heard a thing, as if he didn't quite exist at the same celebration. Elise lowered her head. The event program in her hand started to crumple, not from anger, but from shame. Shame, because once she too had seen him through other people's eyes. Once she thought his clothes looked out of place. Once she wished he wouldn't stand so close. Once she hoped he'd stay behind the frame instead of stepping into it. She hated the feeling returning now, not because of anyone else, but because it came from within her. Elise exhaled softly. Looking around the grand ballroom, she saw only one truth. All this glamour. None of it was worthy of his silence. Music played steadily from the speakers near the stage. A jazz ensemble, part classical, part contemporary. The kind of soundtrack chosen to sound both elegant and safe, just like every other Whitmore family event. But to Elise, every note felt muffled, choked beneath the echoes of those words from just minutes ago. Let's hope he sticks around to clean up after the event. Totally looks like the guy who collects dishes at the end. She didn't need to look back to know where the laughter came from. The table near the wine station, where designer dresses shimmered as their wearers tilted their heads in false laugh poses. There sat Vanessa, the cousin whose tongue was always dipped in honey and venom, and Aunt Beatrice, still drinking her wine with her pinky raised like it was a performance. Elise tried to swallow the rising tide inside. She stood in the center of the room, holding a glass of melted fruit punch, her gaze fixed ahead, as if concentrating on the upcoming speech. But her mind had drifted far from the ballroom. Each giggle behind her felt like another invisible blade, slicing through the carefully crafted shell she had built over the years. The shell of a composed, mature, and grateful daughter. But how could she not tremble when she knew that once she had thought the same way? Her mind flashed back to when she was 16, the first time she was invited to an upper-class birthday party on her mother's side. Jeremiah had driven her there in the same old pickup. She had asked him to stop 3 blocks away from the mansion. She didn't want anyone to see him. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was too real, too different, too out of place in the gilded world she was trying to step into. Elise shuddered. Her hand began to tremble, and the glass nearly slipped from her damp palm. And then, something small happened. A hand gently rested on hers, slow, unforced, no tugging, no pulling, just a simple touch, timed perfectly, with just enough pressure. As if to say, "I'm here." It was Jeremiah, still silent as always. No, "Are you okay?" No, "They're being cruel." No, "You should have said something." He didn't need those words. He knew. She was waging a quiet war inside. And he knew. One gesture was enough to steady her. Elise looked down at that hand. The calluses on his thumb and forefinger etched like memories that never faded. His hand was warm, but not soft. It was the hand of someone who'd changed oil, swept schoolyards, carried neighbors' groceries without expecting thanks. The hand that once steadied her as she learned to ride a bike. The hand that shielded her head when a sudden downpour hit during a night market. The hand that knocked on her door at 2 a.m. just to say, "If you can't sleep, I'm still awake." And now, it simply rested on hers. No permission, no explanation. As if it had always been there, waiting for her to hold it again. Elise felt her throat tighten. From somewhere in the distance, she heard a woman whisper, "It's odd." She's standing next to him like they're really close. Maybe just being polite. Elise didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Instead, she slowly raised her other hand and wrapped it around his. The grip wasn't tight, but it spoke volumes. No more hesitation, no more hiding, no more fear of anyone's gaze. Jeremiah glanced at her. His eyes held no tears, but they shone with something warmer than anything else in that grand room. No one around them knew. Elise had never called him Dad in public. But in that moment, she didn't need to say a word. Because for a man like him, sometimes a hand held is louder than anything spoken. The microphone crackled softly. A light echo from the sound system caused the entire hall to pause for a few seconds. Small conversations fell silent. Glasses were gently set down on glass tables. A steady, composed female voice rose from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Principal Grace Holloway." She stood center stage, posture upright, expression calm, eyes scanning the room as if reading the thoughts of every attendee. She adjusted the mic slightly, then continued with a voice both solemn and commanding enough to still the room. "Before we proceed with the formal honors for our valedictorians and scholarship recipients, the university would like to offer a moment of special recognition." A few heads lifted. Attention began to shift. We are presenting an honorary award that was not previously announced, an award not found in our annual roster." Elise looked up. Her hand still rested on Jeremiah's. Both of them turned toward the stage. "This award is meant to honor someone who is not part of the faculty, not a student, not officially affiliated with the institution, but someone who has been an indispensable part of one graduate's journey, and in truth, of many hearts beyond." A ripple moved across the room. Chairs shifted slightly. Some began whispering among themselves. Jeremiah stood still. No assumptions crossed his mind. His eyes simply followed the woman on stage, like any other parent awaiting the announcement of a valedictorian. But Elise, she sensed something different. Every word from the principal didn't feel directed at the crowd. It felt like a portrait being sketched of someone she knew intimately. This is someone who once walked into the aftermath of a devastating accident. No training, no uniform, no title, but who saved 8 lives. The atmosphere changed. Suddenly, Elise felt her heart pound harder. The scraping of chairs ceased. Whispers turned to quiet gasps. "Wait. What?" Soft, but enough to tighten the air like a stretched wire. "An explosion at the Franklin station, 12 years ago. A day many haven't forgotten, but the person who saved them remained nameless." Elise sat upright. Her throat went dry. The Franklin station explosion. She remembered it. Back then, she was only a 4th grader, just beginning to live with her mother and Jeremiah. The media covered the story for days. They had called the rescuer the unknown Samaritan. This person never appeared in the media, never gave interviews, left behind no name, only a blood-stained coat and a quiet statement. "I just did what was right." A soft, sharp exhale escaped Elise's throat. Quiet. Urgent. No one else heard it. But she felt it, like her lungs had skipped a breath. She turned to look at Jeremiah. He was still watching the stage, expression unchanged, but his eyes, slightly wider than usual, his hand tightened just a little. A reflex, not of fear, but of knowing. The secret he'd guarded for over a decade was about to be laid bare. We traced a series of anonymous donations sent to the Trauma Recovery Center over the past 12 years. The same signature, the same handwriting, and in the end, the same man. Elise felt the entire hall contract, narrow, close. Wine glasses froze in mid-air. Polite smiles turned to questioning stares. Some had begun tilting their heads, murmuring to one another. And then the principal bowed her head slightly, lifting the sheet of paper in her hands to eye level. "Today, we honor that person. The one who chose silence for more than a decade, the one who never asked to be known. But today must be named." A pause. Exactly 3 heartbeats long. Elise heard nothing but her own heartbeat. Then she heard it. Jeremiah Warren. That name dropped into the hall like an arrow piercing straight through the glass of pretense that had lingered all ceremony long. Elise shot to her feet before her mind had a chance to stop her. The chair behind her tipped slightly. The program slipped from her hand and fell at her feet. Unnoticed. Her eyes widened, lips parted, heart pounding like she'd just heard someone speak a forbidden truth she had secretly longed to be said out loud. The entire hall froze. A few people turned to each other, frowning. Whispers broke out. "Jeremiah, who's that? Sounds familiar. Isn't that the—" Then, like a tide pulled by invisible gravity, every gaze in the room shifted. Toward one spot. At the back of the hall, beside a decorative pillar wrapped in silver ribbons. He stood. Jeremiah Warren, unmoving. Not hiding, but not stepping forward either, still standing where he had been. One hand loosely holding the now creased invitation, his face unreadable, but his eyes, those once unassuming eyes, suddenly seemed deeper than anyone had ever noticed. Not with power, but with a truth that could no longer be hidden. Elise looked at him, her chest tightened, not from shock, but from regret. Because she had never known, never asked, never once imagined that the stepfather she had once tried to keep in the background was the very hero an entire city had once searched for. Their eyes met for just a moment, long enough for her to see. He hadn't expected this either, hadn't prepared, had never imagined that the secret he thought he'd take to the grave would be called into the light amid stage lights and applause soon to follow. A silence hung. Then Elise, still standing, began to clap. Slow, firm, deliberate. A clap from someone who no longer wanted to be silent. From a daughter who wanted the whole world to know who her father truly was. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then came a few scattered claps. A teacher from the third row, a curly-haired student in the back, an elderly professor with glasses thick as bottle bottoms. They began to applaud, not because they fully understood, but because they felt the truth that had just been unveiled. The Whitmore family, however, sat frozen. Aunt Beatrice set her wine glass down slowly, dazed. Vanessa frowned, lips tight. The ones who had once mocked him, whispered about him, labeled him the janitor, now didn't know where to look. Jeremiah hadn't moved yet. He looked down at his hand, still holding the invitation. The paper was old, edges bent, but he'd brought it anyway, like a quiet promise. Today was Elise's graduation. He had come only to witness that moment, not to be honored. But then Elise stepped out from her row. She turned to him, nodded. Dad. Her voice was soft, but clear, and that one word was all he needed to hear. He stepped forward, slow, straight, no puffed chest, no bowed head. Every step landed gently, yet struck like thunder in the minds of those who had turned away, judged, dismissed him, as just a poor black stepfather with no place under the lights. The spotlight followed each step, and the entire hall rose to its feet, not because someone signaled them to, but because respect demanded it. As if they had all just realized the hero they once believed existed only in a speech had always been among them, silent, humble, unseen. Jeremiah walked past those who had never greeted him, past the rows of silk ties and polished shoes that once deemed him out of place, past the ones who had called him not a fit. And he walked toward the stage, not as a stepfather, not as a guest, but as the man whose name had just been called. Jeremiah stepped onto the stage as the applause still lingered in the air. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked down, at the polished wooden floor beneath his feet, where the lights shimmered like a thin layer of water. Perhaps the spotlight was too bright. Or perhaps he simply wasn't used to being the one people noticed. For years, Jeremiah had chosen the corners few ever looked toward, the quiet places where he could do what was right, then step back like a tree's shadow, leaving no trace. Before him stood a microphone, lowered to just the right height. A gleaming bronze plaque rested on the podium in honor of silent service. He glanced at it, then looked up again. The hall had fallen completely still. No murmurs, no rustling, only silence. Heavy, expectant. Jeremiah reached up to adjust the mic. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. He took a breath. I didn't think I'd be saying anything today. His voice was gravelly, low, no flair, no practiced cadence. Just a man trying to find words for something he had never prepared to speak. I came here to see my daughter graduate, nothing more. Some eyes welled up, because in that simple sentence, people could hear the quiet years he had spent standing beside Elise, a shadow who loved without ever demanding to be seen. I'm not her biological father. I had no ties to her or her mother when I entered their lives 12 years ago. I was just someone standing at the edge. He paused, looked out across the crowd. Elise was seated in the front row, her eyes locked on his, her hands clenched tight, knuckles pale. Then one day, her father left. The room held its breath. I made no promises, had no paperwork, no custody rights. All I saw was a little girl standing in the living room, suitcase half zipped. She didn't cry, didn't ask why. She just stood there. Jeremiah swallowed hard. I remember making her a glass of milk. I sat beside her, and from that day on, I didn't leave. A soft sob rose from a corner of the hall. I didn't do anything grand. I drove her to school. I fixed her desk lamp. I listened to her play piano, though every time she hit the wrong note, I had to fake a cough just to save her. Laughter rippled through the room, gentle, genuine, unmasked. There were days I was tired, frustrated. Once, I even lost my job. But I kept a straight face so she wouldn't know. But I never once thought of myself as a hero. He looked around, for the first time, truly meeting the eyes of the audience. Saving someone in a train station explosion is easy. Everyone says I was brave, but the truth is, I just ran toward the screaming. I didn't think, didn't fear, didn't hesitate. But being a father, he paused, his eyes glistened. Being a father is waking up an hour earlier to check if her shoes have holes. It's slipping a few extra dollars into her wallet when you know her mother forgot to pay for lunch. It's standing across the street after drop-off because she doesn't call you dad in front of her friends and you don't want her to feel embarrassed. Elise broke down. She bowed her head, tears falling onto her open hands, soaking into the graduation invitation she'd held since the start of the ceremony. Jeremiah looked down at her. I don't need anyone to thank me. I don't need a medal. All I need is for her to know she never had to grow up alone. He glanced down at the mic, gave a small nod. That's enough for me. Then he stepped back. No bow, no wave, just a quiet retreat, the way he had always lived. But this time, the entire hall rose. The applause came like a wave, not wild, not dramatic, but steady, unrelenting, certain, like footsteps walking toward truth. Jeremiah Warren, the man who never asked for a title, had finally been called by his true name. The applause still echoed faintly as Jeremiah stepped off the stage. He didn't rush back to his seat. He stood quietly near the wings, hands clasped together, as if still unsure that all of this was truly happening. Down in the hall, faces that once carried scorn had now turned pale. All the whispers, the condescending glances, the venomous jabs had just been shattered by a few gravel-toned sentences. Aunt Beatrice Whitmore turned awkwardly to Vanessa, lips parting as if to conjure up an excuse, some justification to protect herself from what had just unfolded. But there was none. No one demanded that she bow her head, but nothing could stop the weight of every eye now turning towards her. A gaze not just of disappointment, but of quiet recognition, of her smallness. Vanessa said nothing. She sat stiff, fingernails digging into her knees, her whole body taut. In her mind replayed the image of herself just under an hour ago. Smirking, scoffing, calling Jeremiah the janitor. And now, he was the man the entire hall had just stood for. And she, just a petty relative, memorable not for grace, but for her cruelty. The attention in the hall slowly began to shift. Some looked at Beatrice and Vanessa, but others began to turn toward Elise. Elise Warren was standing. She no longer curled inward like when she first arrived, no longer hid trembling hands in the folds of her dress. She stepped out from her row into the center aisle, walking toward the stage, toward Jeremiah, still standing quietly beneath the dim lights. No one stopped her, no one questioned it. Elise walked with certainty, as though every step was severing an old thread of shame that had bound her since childhood. She stopped in front of him. Her eyes glistened, but they shone. Her hand reached out, this time not out of duty, but out of pride. She gripped his hand. The hall seemed to hold its breath again. As Elise, the one who had always remained silent, the one everyone assumed was ashamed, spoke. "You once told me I didn't have to call you Dad." She turned to face the room, resolute. But today, in front of everyone here, I want to do just that. A stillness. Thank you, Dad, for staying, for never walking away from me. That sentence, simple, unadorned, was like a key. It unlocked and stripped away the last of the emotional disguises that had lingered between people in that room. Jeremiah smiled. He didn't say a word. Elise turned and walked back to her seat. But as she passed the front row, where the Whitmore family sat, She paused. She looked directly at Beatrice. Her gaze held no anger, just calm, the calm of someone who had just laid down a lifelong weight and no longer feared being looked down upon. Beatrice lowered her head. Vanessa avoided her eyes. For the first time that entire ceremony, no one dared to ask, "Who is he?" No one whispered wild guesses about their relationship. No one looked at Jeremiah as an outsider. No one saw Elise as the girl without a real father. From this moment forward, everything was different. Not because of a title, not because of a medal, but because of one clear gaze and a name finally spoken aloud. Jeremiah stood just off stage, still looking stunned. But then Principal Holloway stepped over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you'd like to say more, the hall is still listening." Elise looked toward her father, and for the first time, she was the one who nodded, urging him on. Jeremiah took a deep breath, then stepped back onto the stage. Jeremiah Warren stood before the microphone once more. This time he wasn't hesitant, no longer shrinking back, no longer scanning the crowd with caution. He looked only at Elise, the girl who had just called him Dad. With eyes as still and deep as an autumn lake, the entire room fell silent. "Perhaps," Jeremiah began, voice hoarse but clear, "some of you might think, I'm lucky." He paused, smiled faintly. "Lucky to be called up today, to receive a medal." He looked down at his hands, calloused, weathered by sun and years, fingers bent slightly from a lifetime of fixing engines, scrubbing stovetops, working night shifts. "But the truth is, the greatest luck in my life was getting to care for a child I didn't help create." A soft sound echoed, a quiet stifled breath from somewhere in the middle rows. "I met Elise when she was 3. Her mother was crying, didn't know where to leave her for a night shift. And I was just the parking lot attendant." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, as if the memory still warmed him even now. "She called me Uncle Jay, not Dad. And she didn't have to. I didn't expect her to. I just tried to stay." Every eye was locked on the stage, even those who had never once noticed him could not look away now. Once, Elise got sick, a high fever. I didn't have the money to get her into a proper emergency clinic, so I sat with her all night in the hallway of a public hospital, cold, hungry, but I didn't dare leave to get food, because I was afraid that if I came back, they'd call her name, and I wouldn't be there. His eyes began to well, but he kept smiling. That's when I understood. You don't need shared blood to be a father. You just need to stay, especially when others walk away. Still, the room was silent. No clinking glasses, no buzzing phones, only the sound of truth being told. Jeremiah looked toward Elise. Her biological father. He's probably out there somewhere, living another life, knowing nothing about today. I don't blame him. Everyone has their path. He placed a hand over his chest. But I chose to stay, and that is what I'm most proud of. Not the medal, not the honor, but getting to watch Elise grow into the brave, kind-hearted woman I love more than anything. And at that moment, not just Elise, but several students, a few professors, even a quiet janitor tucked into the back of the room, were in tears, not from pity, but from being moved by a single powerful truth. Love doesn't need a birth certificate. It just needs someone willing to never walk away. Jeremiah bowed his head. He didn't ask for applause, but it came anyway, from every corner of the room. And this time, it wasn't for the award. It was for a man who had just reminded everyone in that hall, sometimes a hero is simply the one who always stays. As the closing music faded and the stage lights dimmed, the hall remained utterly still. There was no laughter now, no popping of champagne corks. The glasses still shimmered under the lights, but no one reached to clink them. Jeremiah stepped down once more, but this time he didn't slip behind the curtains. He didn't bow his head. He walked slowly down the center aisle, like someone returning from a storm, not needing grandeur, but carrying a quiet presence that made people instinctively part to give him space. Elise followed in silence, no longer hiding in anyone's shadow. Her hair tousled, mascara streaked from tears. But her steps were steady. In the corner of the room, Aunt Beatrice stood frozen. Gone was the sharp-tongued aunt's usual poise. Her hands clutched her clutch bag so tightly, her nails pressed into the faux leather without even realizing it. Vanessa Whitmore, the cousin who once mocked, avoided Elise's gaze. Her face flushed red as if she'd just been slapped. And then, something no one expected happened. A young woman from the back of the room stepped forward hesitantly. Elise recognized her, Lindsay, one of the more distant Whitmore relatives, always polite but aloof. Uncle Jeremiah," Lindsay murmured, her eyes glistening. Jeremiah turned to her, giving a small nod. "I didn't know. You had done all those things," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. "Back then, I heard Aunt Beatrice say terrible things about you. Today I realized I was wrong." No one laughed, no one interrupted. Then Beatrice herself stepped forward. Slower than usual, she stopped in front of Jeremiah Dash, the man she had once forbidden from entering her home during a family gathering. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we didn't know." Jeremiah looked at her. His eyes held no anger, no sorrow, only depth, like the sea on a stormy night. "You didn't need to know," he replied quietly, his voice calm, as if the words had waited years to be spoken. "But you chose to wound." Beatrice froze. No one else in the room said a word. Elise stood still. She had never seen her father so strong, and yet so gentle. This wasn't triumph, it was release. A few others stepped forward. They didn't say much, just offered handshakes. Some gave quiet nods, but the nods weren't hollow. Not anymore. Jeremiah shook each hand. No pride, no pretense. Every handshake felt like a door closing, and another quietly opening. The air in the hall had changed. The people were the same, the chairs and tables were the same. But the unseen order of power, of pride, of quiet cruelty had shifted. The ceremony ended in silence. No after-party, no crowd huddled for selfies, as in years past, only the sound of soft footsteps, and a story that everyone would remember, even if no one dared speak of it right away. And in the minds of all who stepped out of Riverside University that afternoon, one image remained: a man in a worn blazer, standing taller than anyone else. The small third-floor apartment in Maple Grove was quiet that afternoon. No traffic sounds, no TV, only sunlight slanting gently through the window, falling across the worn wooden table and the chair where Jeremiah used to sit with his old newspapers. Elise opened the door and stepped in, a hand clutching a bouquet of faded pastel flowers, the other pulling the small suitcase she'd brought from the dorm. The apartment still carried its familiar scent: mint, old coffee, and a faint trace of motor oil from Jeremiah's worn boots. She walked into the kitchen. On the old refrigerator, everything was just as it had always been. The handwritten note reminding them when to change the oil. The electric bill held up by a chipped Yankees magnet, and still in place. A crayon drawing she'd made in 3rd grade, my hero Jeremiah, childish handwriting. A big man holding a little girl wearing a graduation cap. Elise lifted the drawing down. She sat at the table and laid it in front of her. Her fingers traced the edges slowly. The colors had faded, the corners frayed from time, and from the hundreds of times Jeremiah had taped it up, then taken it down, then taped it up again during his kitchen cleanings. She pulled out a new photo, taken that very afternoon, Jeremiah on stage, not looking at the camera, but bowing toward the audience. The stage lights caught one side of his face, highlighting the wrinkles once dismissed as old, outdated. But now to Elise, they carried calm, strength, and a beauty more real than anyone else in that room. She taped the photo to the center of the fridge, right where the old drawing used to be. Her fingers pressed each corner down carefully, as if afraid a gust of wind might shift it. Then she turned, placed the crayon drawing into a small frame, and set it gently on the wooden shelf facing the dining table. the same spot where Jeremiah used to leave his morning paper. The old drawing wasn't replaced. It was honored, given a new place that suited it better. No music played, no grand speeches, only the quiet sound of a chair sliding across the floor. And Elise's voice, soft, almost unsure whether she was speaking to her father or just to herself. From now on, whenever someone walks in here, they'll know who my father is. No more questions. She sat there for a long time, gazing at the fridge and at the little frame on the shelf. One new photograph and one old memory, finally placed where it had always belonged. Late afternoon the next day, Elise was making dinner in the small kitchen. No celebration, no champagne, no well-wishers gathered like her classmates, who had gone out to fancy restaurants after the ceremony. She was simply standing there, in front of the old gas stove, stir-frying vegetables and flipping slices of meat. Jeremiah had just returned from the old auto shop. His clothes still bore smudges of grease. He washed his hands, dried them, and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of food made him pause. "Didn't know anyone was cooking today," he said with a smile. "I figured you deserved a dinner where you don't have to wash the pans," Elise replied. Jeremiah was about to answer with a joke, but his eyes suddenly stopped. On the fridge, the photo, the picture of him on stage. The moment Elise had stood and applauded before hundreds. Now placed right in the center, carefully aligned. In the corner of the photo, a small handwritten note had been added by Elise. "This is my father, the man who never left me." Jeremiah fell silent. He stepped closer, lightly touched the edge of the photo, then turned back to look at his daughter, saying nothing, just with his eyes. But they carried more than any words Elise had ever heard from him. She set down the plate of meat, pulled out a chair for him. "I know you never needed recognition. I know you never asked to be called Dad. But yesterday, when I saw you standing there, I thought, the world needs to see what I've seen since I was 7. Jeremiah said nothing. He pulled out the chair, sat down, picked up his chopsticks. "All I need is for you to know," he said softly. "Whether anyone else sees it or not, doesn't matter." Elise smiled. A soft smile, like someone finally shedding a burden they'd carried since childhood. The two of them ate in silence. No music, no sparkling lights, only the quiet clink of chopsticks against porcelain. And two people, once separated by doubt and shame, now fully seen and understood, in the simplest place of all, an old kitchen filled with warm light, and a truth that no longer needed hiding. Late evening. Outside, the wind rustled through the dry trees, already shedding their leaves too early. Inside the small living room, only a soft desk lamp cast its gentle glow over Jeremiah. Seated with his back resting against the sofa, eyes half closed, Elise sat beside him, her head leaning gently on his shoulder. She was no longer wearing her graduation gown. No Dean's List medal hung from her neck, just a worn sweater and soft slacks. Like the most ordinary days of their life, but to Jeremiah there was nothing ordinary about this moment. The applause was gone. The stage lights were dark, no more praise blaring from the speakers. Just a father, once called the driver, the janitor, sitting not to prove anything, but simply to be there, as he always had been. Elise spoke. "I remember, when I was little, whenever you were late picking me up, I used to get so mad. All my friends had dads in suits, fancy cars, and you—" She paused, then chuckled. "You'd show up in grease-stained shirts. Some days, you even forgot to button your collar." Jeremiah smiled and gave a small nod. "I wasn't exactly polished." Elise tilted her head to look at him, eyes glassy. "Number? But you were the only one who never left me." Silence, but not awkward, not heavy. Just the kind of silence people keep when holding something sacred. After a while, Jeremiah looked out the window. Streetlights spilled long streaks across the glass. He murmured almost to himself, "People don't need to know my name. As long as I know, I stayed." Elise didn't reply. She just reached out and held his hand. In the corner of the room, The framed photo on the fridge caught the lamp's soft glow, reflecting the image of a man who had once stood before a crowd of strangers. But the look in his eyes, then and now, was the same, steady, warm, and no longer needing to prove a thing. They once called him the janitor. Now he was simply Dad, and that was enough. Not everyone who brings us into the world is the one who truly raises us. Not everyone with a title gives us the love we need. Jeremiah lived quietly, loved quietly, and suffered quietly. But that day, he was no longer the shadow behind the stage. He was the light his daughter and the entire room finally saw. If you've ever had someone like that in your life, don't wait until the lights go out to call them family. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever loved silently, without asking for recognition. We have many more stories like this, and we hope you'll stay with us to hear them.